welcome John Dayal to this series on 50 years of emergency in depth and in person. John Dayal is a senior journalist and an activist now. He was on the ground reporting about what and how emergency played out for Delhi. He was a local reporter with the Patriot newspaper, which is no longer there, but uh, trained some of the fine journalists of this country. And John has been one of the best from the Patriot School of Journalism, as they say. And John, welcome. And you're a reporter. Where were you on the night when the emergency was declared, and how did you went about reporting it? What was the atmosphere like?
Emergency for newspapers really came at midnight on 25th June when the power was switched off. The printing presses were about to start and power was switched off, but nobody knew that it was switched off because of the emergency. Also, it was partial. Power was switched off to what was called the Press Lane or Fleet Street, Bazusha Zafamag, but not to Connaught Place. So, as a result, Hindustan Times and the Statesman had their power and, in fact, did bring out editions. The Patriot at one end of Fleet Street and the Indian Express at the other end of Fleet Street suddenly found their electricity switched off and therefore did not come the next day. All of us were in office till about 10:30, 11 the previous night. But as I said, till the power went off, we weren't any the wiser. There was no announcement, there was no nothing, there was no Mr. Narendra Modi coming on TV and saying there will be no notes after 12 o'clock. So emergency was something that was understood only the next morning. Few papers, as I said, like the Statesman and the Hindustan Times in Delhi, as also outstation papers carried the news that emergency had been declared. So
John, one second. I want to ask, clarify it for the viewers, whether emergency came as an announcement or just a press note to all the newspapers and the public. A physical announcement, a television or radio.
To newspapers, it came first as a switch off the power. And the press note from the PIB followed, which was basically after the president had signed the relevant resolution and order, then it was imposed. So, as a matter of fact, half of the newspapers in the country read about the emergency in the few papers that did come out.
So, which means that the first day there was no censorship. It was only abruption. They just switched off the power for some of the papers and didn't allow them to print. And when did the censorship start then?
Oh, the next morning. As soon as all of us came to office, we knew there was an emergency, and the orders started coming, and we were told that henceforth press reports would have to be censored and would have to be taken to Shastri Bhavan for the censor to censor that.
Okay. So what was the process like? The reporters filed a story to the chief reporter or the chief of bureau, and chief of bureau sends somebody with a physical copy because there's no online system those days. So or the reporters themselves had to go to PIB and get it cleared. What was the system like those days?
See, for every single journalist in the country, it's the first time emergency had been declared and that there was censorship other than censorship, which was a norm when there was a war. Under the Defense of India rules, there was a censorship and most of it was self-imposed rather than by government. But this was the first time that a rigorous censorship was being imposed. And all of us learned that the process was you print your newspaper, take the galley proofs or the page proofs to the censor officer, who were all the PIB officers had turned censor officers, with the PIO, the Principal Information Officer, as the Chief Censor Officer. So we took our copies there, and somebody, a junior officer usually, under orders, would line out, strike out all that could come and all that could not come. Usually, most of it was not striked out because already people were observing some sort of a self-censorship. And also, we did not know what was censorious, what was to be censored, and what was not to be censored. So it was trial and error on all sides for the first couple of days. Then, of course, it was quite clear that any news about Sanjay Gandhi had to pass censors. Any news about emergency itself had to pass censors. Any news about Mrs. Indira Gandhi had to pass censors. And as Sanjay Gandhi and Indira Gandhi and all their cohorts started playing out their version of the emergency, we came to know what could be and what could not be. Editorials were a major target of the censorship because editorials were opinions.
Okay.
Reports were just reports, and some of them were innocuous reports. If Sanjay Gandhi was inaugurating something, it was just an inauguration and it would not be censored. But an editorial opinion, which meant editorials, editorial articles, editorial comments, op-eds, they were censored. Also in reports, long reports of seminars and all that, if there was some critic and he said something, that portion was cleared, not cleared, and the rest of the report was cleared. So
Okay.
newspapers had gaps.
Okay. You were in a paper where Edathatta Narayanan was the legendary editor, was the editor those days. And I was told that he didn't allow any mention of Sanjay Gandhi in the paper. And how did you
No,
manage it? And did it create problems for Patriot itself?
Editor Narayanan was a unique person. He was pro-Soviet, pro-CPI. The CPI was pro-emergency. So it was a piquant situation. Editorial policy, which was pro-CPI, would in fact have demanded that we support emergency. Editor Narayanan's editorial policy was that we support the issues on which emergency had been declared, which was Jayaprakash Narayan's Poon Swarajya, which he thought was anti-democracy, anti-liberty, anti-everything that he held to be dear, and was being done for reasons other than altruistic, other than democratic, and other than pro-people of the country. So he was quite clear that while editorially the Patriot supported the emergency, the acts of the emergency were not what Patriot was supporting.
Okay.
All acts that were constitutional, Patriot supported. All acts that were extra-constitutional, non-constitutional, or anti-constitutional, Patriot vehemently opposed. And that means Sanjay Gandhi was not a constitutional authority. He was an extra-constitutional authority. And thus, in fact, Editor Narayanan became the first person to start calling him, the second son of Mrs. Gandhi, an extra-constitutional power of authority.
Did that editorial stand create problem for Patriot functioning in any way?
It allowed us to hold our head high during the emergency and after the emergency. So while a couple of papers, which were otherwise very anti-people from my point of view, became heroes of the emergency, I don't want to name names. Even posthumously, I don't want to name names. But in their actions, one paper, which was a hero of the emergency, printed a 4-column newspaper photograph of Sanjay Gandhi going up in a balloon at the Chandigarh session of the Congress. Patriot did not, because Sanjay Gandhi was anathema to Patriot. And we went after Sanjay Gandhi's actions, hammer and tongs. So Patriot was among the few papers which were reporting demolitions, which are reporting sterilizations, which are reporting all sorts of things. Whereas heroes of the emergency were not doing all that.
Okay. So I'm told in Delhi, you are reporting local affairs of Delhi, and the demolition in Old Delhi was a major issue, which which ensured that certain minority communities went totally against Mrs. Gandhi and emergency. How was it played out? How could you report that truthfully, or was it also censored?
Even now, for all journalists of all times, there's only one journalism: to report truthfully. What is reported untruthfully is not journalism. So we'll leave that definition of journalism aside. It was very easy because the editorial instructions were clear: report as if nothing had happened. And therefore, we discovered that Mr. Sanjay Gandhi had a twin agenda for Delhi. He was, as today Mr. Modi does it, trying to beautify the capital in a very clinical, juvenile way. Remove slums, not improve quality of life, remove slums because they were eyesores in his eyes. So all the slums around All India Institute of Medical Sciences were removed. Some of them were what I called organic slums. They were Padis, Tamils, who were living as communities, as families, with a culture, vibrant culture in those areas. They were removed and settled in resettlement colonies. I'll come to them in a minute. In the areas which Sanjay Gandhi deemed to be ghettos, Jama Masjid, Turkman Gate, Sabzi Mandi, all the ilakas of Old Delhi, Shahjahabad, were deemed to be eyesores in Mr. Sanjay Gandhi's eyes. And he went with his bulldozer against them. And he had very pliant, very enthusiastic officers like Mr. Jagmohan, who was the DDA person and later the Lieutenant Governor, Mr. Binder, the policeman, and many others. Some of them were possibly junior IAS officers, Mr. Naveen Chawla. So maybe they could claim that they had no option. Naveen Chawla was a secretary of the Lieutenant Governor. Mr. Chawla died very recently. So officers, junior or senior, were very supportive of Mr. Sanjay Gandhi. Maybe out of fear, maybe they agreed. And I tend to think that many of them were Islamophobes.
Okay.
The emergency.
Yeah. Some of them joined. Some of them joined the parties which are known for Islamophobia and become mantris and all these things.
If I may make a bold statement now,
yeah.
Underpinning the emergency was a sense of Islamophobia. And it was apparent in the programs on family planning, for instance, which was universal, but more universal for the Muslims than for others, and so on and so forth. And demolition was the same. It was more critical for the Muslims than for others, although everybody suffered. Lakhs and lakhs of people were unhoused. Their houses were broken, and they were settled in resettlement colonies. The resettlement colonies 50 years later are all right, but then there were just lines on the ground. There were no toilets, there was no water, there was nothing. It was just a dusty ground with lines in remote areas, in Mongolpuri, Trilokpuri, in Sultanpuri, Dakshinpuri. These are puris, but those days they were in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of forests, in the middle of fields. There were just lines of chalk on the ground.
Okay. So, you reported all that momentous events which during the emergency. Which is the one which comes to your mind, which is etched in your memory, and also tragic, which exposes the cruelty or the dark days of emergency, as they say?
See, the two cases. One is about sterilizations, and one is about demolitions. They tried to remove the shops from along the wall of Jama Masjid. They forgot that the shops were an intrinsic part of the Jama Masjid. And when they tried to remove the shops, they discovered that possibly the walls of the masjid could collapse. So the project was immediately abandoned. But the projects elsewhere in Turkman Gate continued. And there was firing and there were lots of deaths, untold number of deaths. Even today we do not know how many people really died. That was the biggest human tragedy as a group of people. The individual tragedies were people who were sterilized. Some of them were grown-up people. Some of them were in the reproduction age, but some of them were old people. And they were sterilized because the orders were for officers to fulfill quotas, for school teachers to fulfill quotas, for government staff to fulfill quotas. So unless they had completed X number of sterilizations a month, they would not get their salary. And that forced many of them to try things which were inhuman. And there were many cases where a person was sterilized more than once, or a juvenile was sterilized.
Was any journalist arrested or penalized for what he wrote or what he wanted to write? Of course, Kuldeep Nair was arrested, I'm told, from Indian
But
Express.
Kuldeep Nair was also a full-time politician. So his arrest has to be logged in both arrest of a journalist and among the arrested for political activities.
Okay.
George Varghese was also a political person, and to an extent Ajit Bhattacharya, but they were not arrested. The person who was arrested for no fault of his was Virendra Kapoor. He was then only a young reporter, a small-time reporter in Motherland. His wife was also a reporter of Motherland, Kobi Kapoor. And Virendra was arrested for apparently a skirmish he had with a youth Congress person.
Okay. Not for writing something. Motherland, I am told, was close to RSS and Jan Sangh those days. Or
No, it was
owned
the
by
official
them.
organ. Motherland was almost the official organ of the, or official daily of the RSS and BJP. But it was a newspaper. It was a registered newspaper. But many other papers were censored but not closed.
Okay. So,
So in retrospect, very few journalists were arrested in the country.
Okay. So, which means that despite emergency and draconian powers, Mrs. Gandhi's regime was not so cruel on journalists with different opinion. Like the way maybe today, if you compare, you can compare today and those days.
Today's Gundaism of a very different sort. And Mr. Modi is a tyrant. Mrs. Gandhi became anti-democratic when she imposed the emergency. But at heart, she was a Democrat. And maybe that is why she lifted the emergency. Mr. Modi's emergency is now in the 12th year. Ms. Indira Gandhi's emergency did not last 2 full years.